Hi, I'm Nathan, and welcome to week 7 of Durham's MEMSA Gardens Community Course Talks. Now, what I want to discuss with you today is how the gardens of the Tudor and Stuart gentry might have been used to cater for mental and physical health. This won't be along the lines of the use and growing of medicinal herbs, but instead we'll be looking at alternative approaches. So we'll be taking a look at exercise, the senses, spirituality, and a man I believe is one of the most interesting gardeners of the 17th century. As for the material we'll be looking at today, I'll be quoting from a ton of health guides and gardening manuals from the period. These are basically what they say on the tin. Health guides included things related to the four humours, recipes for making cures against various ailments, while gardening manuals normally covered everything from soil maintenance, the growing of trees and flowers and fruit and veg, and how to deal with pests. And they'd both normally be aimed at the higher standing members of society, so the gentry and the large landowners, the sorts of people who owned large gardens which held more in them than just crops. Also, since this is about feeling good in the garden, if you can watch this on tablet or your phone, then by all means watch it outside. It's a lovely day here in Merseyside today. It's quite a rarity. So if you can watch it outside with nice weather, by all means do so. And when I'm talking, especially about the senses, I'd like you to think about that and see if you feel any of it relates to you at all while you're relaxing out there. If not, if you can't, don't worry about it. You're not missing out, so let's jump in. So we'll start with physical health, and gardens supported this in numerous ways. Taking a look at a couple of health guides, it becomes apparent that there was a fear that the idle and sedentary lifestyle of the gentry, the target demographic of these books, would lead to health concerns. William Bullion's The Government of Health, which was first published in 1558, was an unusual health guide in that the information it presented was in the form of a conversation between two men, John and Humphrey, with John asking Humphrey various health-related questions to which Humphrey offers advice and cures. And on the whole, the book is essentially just a back and forth between the two men. But due to its layout, at first glance, the work, you'd think you'd stumbled across a play script of sorts. However, the dialogue really falls flat towards the end. John's questions essentially just end up acting as subheadings, and he no longer responds to Humphrey in the way of a typical conversation, and Humphrey just lists paragraphs and paragraphs worth of advice with each question. But despite that, I think Bullion wrote in this fashion to try and make the work seem less stuffy and instead more natural and relatable to his readership. But because of this, it leaves John with some lines which I believe would leave Shakespeare turning in his grave. So naturally, I'm going to share a few for you. Tell me somewhat of bread. Who can forget the classic line, "What is the virtue of our common salt?" And my personal favourite, "What sayest thou unto mustard?" Despite this, it's still a great text for understanding some of the anxieties around health in the period. At one point, John asks Humphrey why, often when he and his family find themselves ill, their servants are seemingly okay, showing no symptoms whatsoever. Humphrey replies to this by saying it's down to the work of the servants, that in carrying out physically demanding tasks, their bodies are healthier and more resilient to the world around them. He makes note in particular of the good health of blacksmiths, ploughmen, hunters, and, you've guessed it, gardeners. He says, "He which doth abstain from exercise shall lack the joys of health and quietness, both of body and mind. That idleness is idle the destroyer of life, and that exercise doth occupy every part of the body and quicken the spirits." So with a need to keep good physical health and without doing work that was beneath them, how could the gentry do this? Well, Bullien's Guide, as well as others such as Thomas Eliot's The Castle of Health, which was first published around 1537, list various exercises which include tennis, dancing, running, wrestling, bowls, push-ups, stretches, and even a spot of gardening. Now, carrying out these exercises was believed to be good for staying fit, but also in helping digestion and cleansing the pores via perspiration. So, in many ways, the views of the benefits of exercise weren't too different from those that we hold today. Nor were the warnings of an idle lifestyle, which we've seen amplified over the years due to the spread of office jobs, Netflix marathons, and scrolling down your phone till daft o'clock at night. A final note on exercise is that gardens provided the ideal setting for it. As the Tudor physician Thomas Cogan suggested, exercising in a confined space while you're breathing in and out puts you at more risk from foul air, and therefore a good open and well ventilated space was the preferred place to carry out these exercises, so such as the garden. And this links into the next part of our discussion, and that's the opposite of foul air, fresh air. Now, this mentioning of air is important in particular because it was deemed such a vital aspect for good health and recovery from illness. Take, for example, this quote from Andrew Bard in his health guide, The Compendious Regiment or Dietary of Health. He says, "The air cannot be too clean and pure, considering it doth compass us round about, and we do receive it into us. We cannot be without it, for we live by it as the fish liveth by water. Good air is therefore to be praised, for it is the air be frisk, pure, and clean about the mansion or house. It doth conserve the life of man." If the air smelt nice, it was deemed good for the body, so what better place for this than the garden? One garden writer, Ralph Austin, suggested that compared to, say, food or drink, which had to be digested before their benefits came about, the sweet perfumes of the garden, on the other hand, worked almost immediately in providing a health benefit. Nice smelling air was also used to enhance the experience of walking around a garden. Francis Bacon, most influential for solidifying the scientific method, and quite possibly the only ever person to die from refrigerating a chicken, recommended scattering herbs along the alleyways of your garden walks, so that when they were trodden on it would release another form of therapeutic smell, which again was seen to have a health benefit. These included plants like mint, thyme, and burnet, though for general planting he believed that violets gave off the greatest smell in the garden. Whether someone's having a barbecue in your neighbourhood or you've walked past a farmer's field during muck spreading season, you'll know that smells don't stay confined to the areas that they originated from, and householders use this to their advantage. If you look at a lot of layouts of manor houses, you'll often find that the main bedchambers overlook the gardens, and if you were to peer out the windows of these rooms, you would find below in the garden a flower bed of sweet-smelling flowers and herbs. This would allow the pleasant smells to fumigate the bedchambers of the property. And obviously for those rooms which didn't face the garden, herbs and flowers could be cut and placed around the house, and even put into fireplaces in an attempt to improve the air quality. I think this sort of thing is important to emphasise regarding the benefits of gardens, because sometimes it's viewed that the benefits just stayed within the garden walls, when in actual fact the benefits outgrew the garden, as it were. Gardens were a place where the senses were allowed to run wild. Already in this talk we've dealt with some of them. We've looked at smell, and I guess exercise could count as touch. But how else did gardens appeal to the senses? Well, just like in the gardens of today, birds were actively encouraged in the garden, and not just because they helped deal with pests. In the Gardening Manual, A New Orchard and Garden, first written by William Lawson in 1618, he describes the song of the wren, claiming it to be a distinct whistle like a sweet recorder to cheer your spirits. Now, I thought I'd try and be all sophisticated to try and get some bird calls, but I guess it was breakfast time for them and they just ended up fighting, so I don't think the sounds in this video
really represent the sounds that Lawson meant.
Ralph Austin suggested that the sounds of birds was enhanced by the already peaceful atmosphere in the garden, so in a way it complemented it. Essentially, birdsong provided the soundtrack to your therapeutic and relaxing experience in the garden, and gardening manuals recommended bird cages be placed in the garden so that a continuous sound of birdsong was always present.
As for the sense of sight in the garden, as you can imagine, it was easily pleased by the wide array of colours from both flowers and fruits which grew within it. But what I want to focus on is probably the bit we take for granted, and that's the grass. Grass, or more specifically the colour green, as the historian Cowell Rawcliffe has written, was believed to refresh the eyes and help diminish the loss of sight which comes with ageing. For Francis Bacon, who I discussed earlier, in his essay on gardens, he stated that nothing is more pleasant to the eye than grass kept finely shorn.
Firstly, this reveals that Francis Bacon was quite possibly the most easily entertained man in England at the time. But secondly, it also gives a bit of an insight to the values of the time, the need to have a well maintained garden. It links into the themes of order and symmetry, which had first originated in Renaissance Italy. Now, I've talked quite a bit about how gardens can be good for physical health and how they can create an atmosphere that's also good for the mind, but now I want to talk about the actual act of gardening.
For this, I think it's time that I properly introduced Ralph Austin. Now, I've mentioned him a few times already, but who exactly was he? Well, he was born around 1612 and he died in 1672, and he was a prolific gardener and husbandryman as well as a devout Puritan living in Oxford. He started a campaign to try and convince people to get involved with the planting of trees, and he had hoped that the said trees could be used in shipbuilding for the defence of the nation, but also for use as fuel, and he wanted trees to be maintained in the same way that bridges and roads were at the time, and saw them as vital for the running of the nation. In 1653, he published a treatise of fruit trees. The image that you're looking at now is from the front cover of it. It was a gardening manual which leaned heavily on Austin's beliefs. A good portion of the first quarter of the book was Austin trying to argue why the reader should take up gardening, and he used biblical references and the mentioning of historical figures who also gardened to do so. Now, he did this to try and build up a historic and religious continuity that gardening was a worthy endeavour.
But what I want to focus on is how he argued that gardening was good for health. In his manual, he talks about the spirit which resides in the body, which he claims is the body's master workman, the uppermost wheel which turns the rest of the body. In this sense, he means spirit as in motivation or willpower or drive. Within his work, he suggests that there are three affections of the mind which, in turn, affect the spirits in a positive way, which the garden can help provide. The first of these spirit reviving affections is hope, which came about through the sowing of seeds and the desire of a good crop later in the year. Gardening provides the gardener with something to look forward to in the long run, something to strive towards, and once the plants and crops had successfully grown, the hope would be renewed and would instead be put towards looking forward to next year instead. The second affection is joy, and the spirits are revived here through the literal fruits of the gardener's labours. Joy is received through seeing your hard work pay off and being able to eat the produce you've grown or walk and smell the garden that you've planted. The final one is admiration, and he says that we should just look around the garden and just look in wonder at it. How the smallest of seeds can turn into massive trees, or how beautiful and round fruits can spring from rough, rugged trees. And that by taking the smallest sample of a tree and planting it, we can generate a tree that's just as big as the original. And he's even amazed at all the substances that come from trees. I think he actually gives Francis Bacon a run for his money in how entertained by gardens it can be. He's in awe at the fact that trees can generate sap, bark, wood, pitch, blossoms, and all these other things we've already mentioned. It's clear that Austin was passionate about gardens and that it gave him an energy and a drive which makes him so notable. So notable, in fact, that here I am talking about him all these years later. So that's it, a quick stop guide for how gardens in the 16th and 17th centuries might have been used to aid in mental and physical health. Now, I do realise I've covered quite a few broad topics today, so if you'd like to know anything else about them in particular, then please do drop an email or message me on Twitter. The links to those will be here somewhere now. Or you can just leave a message in YouTube's comment section and I'll make sure to check them and respond. Lastly, I would like to thank Charlotte and Anna Rose for not only organising the event, but for reorganising it so it could go online instead. I've never actually done a talk like this before, nor have I done a video before, so it's been a fun learning experience, and I hope you all learned something as well today, so thanks a lot.